The dramatic events which were played out on the Russian front during the titanic struggle between Hitler and Stalin reached a peak of intensity and decisiveness on the southern front, the area of Army Group South. It was this sector which witnessed the terrible siege of Sevastopol, the disaster at Stalingrad, the fury of Operation Citadel, and the horrors of the Korsun Pocket. It is no exaggeration to say that the outcome of World War II was decided here. When Hitler decided on his surprise attack on Russia, the Army High Command produced a plan which envisaged a strike by 3 separate army groups. This huge mass of men included over 3.5 million German soldiers, supported by 3,500 tanks. Army Group North was to strike through the Baltic states and drive on towards Leningrad. Army Group Center was poised to strike at Moscow, and Army Group South was ordered to drive into the southern part of the USSR. The initial targets were Odessa and the Crimea, but the final strategic objective was the capture of the oil fields in the Caucasus. Army Group South was commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He had at his disposal 3 separate subsidiary armies: the 6th Army, initially commanded by von Reichenau, the 11th Army, commanded by von Schobert, and the 17th Army, under Stulpnagel. They were supported by a powerful armored formation known as Panzer Group 1, under the leadership of von Kleist. Air cover was provided by Luftflotte 1, under General Keller.
Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was a well-known and well-respected German military leader. He had played a key role in the invasion of France in 1940 and had been amongst German units who had come closest to Paris in 1914 during the beginning of the First World War. He was well respected by the commanders underneath him and by the troops. He was known as a somewhat reserved and haughty individual, but nevertheless represented a very obvious symbol of traditional German military excellence.
Unlike the other 2 army groups, Army Group South was not entirely composed of German divisions. A considerable portion of the 11th Army was made up of Romanian forces. Although these men could and would fight with great courage, their training and equipment was certainly inferior to the Wehrmacht. The principal reason for the inclusion of Romanian formations in Army Group South was the fact that von Rundstedt's army group was to act in close cooperation with the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies. The Romanians were to join with the Germans as allies for the unheralded assault on Russia. That great surprise attack was codenamed Operation Barbarossa. It was launched on June the 22nd, 1941.
In the first phase of the German invasion of Russia and operations in the south, the Romanian forces were really a considerable advantage. While von Rundstedt was held up, in a sense, in the northern part of the southern theatre, the Romanians were able to drive through the Soviet lines and begin the first of a series of major outflanking movements. And in terms of movements further east into the whole of the southern theatre, I think it can be said that the Romanians were an important and significant assistance to the Germans.
There's been a historical tendency to blame the Romanian formations for all the ills that the German army suffered on the southern area of the front during the war. In actual fact, it is a historical irony that in some ways the presence of so many Romanian troops was beneficial to the German army, for it made up the numerical deficit that the German armed forces suffered from and enabled them to present a continuous front right across from Leningrad to the Black Sea. That being said, there is no doubt that the Romanian armies were of inferior quality to their German counterparts. They were less well equipped and less well led. In the Battle of Odessa in the early stages of the campaign of 1941, it would be true to say that they did not distinguish themselves and eventually were reliant upon German help to overcome their Russian opponents within Odessa.
With the benefit of hindsight, it could be interpreted as an omen of the ill things to come, but Army Group South was, from the outset, the least successful of the three army groups during the initial onslaught. While Army Group North and Centre reported incredible advances of hundreds of miles, Army Group South encountered tough resistance from the Red Army's southwest and southern fronts.
What happened with Army Group South when it launched the initial attacks in June and July 1941? They came up against very stiff Soviet resistance. First of all, the southwestern front, what had formerly been the Kiev Special Military District, was enormously strong. It perhaps was the strongest of all the Soviet fronts. This was the front in which the Soviet command had earlier argued that it was the force which should launch the counter-strike against the Germans. So in terms of armor, in terms of aviation, in terms of infantry, and in terms of support, this was a formidable opponent. And von Rundstedt rapidly discovered this and admits both in his own war diary and in the German High Command war diary, they made very slow progress indeed.
By the standards of any other campaign, the initial gains made by Army Group South would have been outstanding. But compared to the other two German army groups, progress was relatively slow.
Since 1940, the Russian High Command had been anticipating the main blow in the south. They understood the German desire to occupy areas of the eastern Ukraine to acquire agricultural and economic resources. The Russian High Command therefore placed its best formations of the highest quality and the greatest quantity of mechanized forces in the south to oppose what they anticipated being the main German blow. From the very earliest hours of the war, therefore, in the south, Army Group South was forced to fight its way forward in altogether more bitter and prolonged battles than its counterparts on the rest of the front.
Bit by bit, however, objectives were being taken, and in July, after tough fighting, Army Group South was able to report its first great success, the capture of a huge pocket of 100,000 encircled Russian troops near Uman. There was more to come. With the help of Panzer Group II from Army Group Centre, von Kleist's Panzer Group I was able to complete the encirclement of a further huge pocket of dazed Russian prisoners outside Kiev. Army Group South had played its part in the largest victory in history. The unfortunate captives had nothing to celebrate.
The problem with the German army and the Soviet prisoners is the Germans had not made any preparations at all for the reception of such enormous bodies of prisoners as were taken. After all, the encirclement in the Battle of Kiev in 1941 resulted in a prisoner total of 650,000 men.
The basic problem was that Army Group South was required to conduct its operations with maximum speed in order to acquire the maximum terrain before the winter weather arrived, which would make the conduct of mobile operations extremely difficult. This was to some extent incompatible in transport terms with due adequate care and provision of Russian prisoners of war and the provision of proper housing facilities and foodstuffs. Therefore, it's fair to say that in common with their sister formations, Army Group South did not cater for the interests of Russian prisoners of war.
When columns of prisoners were marched to their assembly points, if any prisoner was ill or fell down or was wounded, he was simply shot. They treated the prisoners from Central Asia especially bestially, under the mistaken idea that even some of them were Jews, which they weren't. And so that group of prisoners, Red Army soldiers from Central Asia, as I say, suffered perhaps more than others, though all others suffered extremely badly. What happened near Kiev actually was quite interesting, because although there was a large tally of prisoners there, what the Germans did was to release quite a number of prisoners into the community to show the occupied population that Germans really weren't as bad as people thought.
Other successes in the opening year of the campaign for Army Group South included the capture of the port of Odessa after a 3-month siege by the Romanian Fourth Army. There was also the successful seizure of the Crimean Peninsula, most of which was in German hands by October the 30th, 1941. Only the fortress city of Sevastopol remained to the Soviets, but the city was already under siege by the German 17th Army, who bombarded the defenses mercilessly, while the planes of Luftflotte 1 kept up a merciless rain of death from the skies. While the defenders of Sevastopol were bottled up, the rest of Army Group South rolled onwards through the Kherson Peninsula, which was the scene of further heavy fighting. By the end of October, Army Group South held a line which ran from approximately Kharkov in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The limit of the advance in that first year of the war proved to be the city of Rostov-on-Don. The forces of Army Group South, with their supply lines massively overstretched and the troops exhausted, could at present do no more for Adolf Hitler. It was not enough for the Führer. During the bitter winter of 1941, fierce Russian counterattacks began to push the German forces backwards. Rundstedt, for the first time in the campaign, asked for permission to withdraw.
Field Marshal Georg von Rundstedt had actually wanted to halt the operations of Army Group South as early as the 4th of November 1941 because he believed that Army Group South was advancing too far to sustain its combat power. Hitler refused. In late November 1941, Marshal Timoshenko, leading the Russian forces in the southern area of the front, launched a Russian counter-offensive in the area of Rostov. On the 28th of December, 1st Panzer Army, in agreement with Rundstedt, decided to evacuate Rostov and requested permission to withdraw 80 miles to the west in order to take up a reasonable defensive position for the winter months behind the River Meuse. Hitler again refused, and on the 1st of December removed von Rundstedt from his position as the commander of Army Group South.
But it made no difference on the ground. The withdrawal from Rostov had to be carried out as a matter of military necessity. The situation was just too difficult, and the German forces withdrew in good order 40 miles west of Rostov. It was the first retreat of the war in the south.
When Field Marshal von Bock took over Army Group South as an emergency measure, he assumed that Army Group South was more or less safe, and that all it basically had to do was simply to ride out the winter. If it was able to ride out the winter, then in fact the situation would be fine. But the situation changed very rapidly, because what the Soviet command entertained was a major offensive operation in the south. This was a major, major threat, and that Army Group South had to do all it could to hold back these Soviet offensive drives, which penetrated quite some considerable distance. But like many things, the Soviet drive simply ran out of steam. It ran out of logistical support. It suffered from very heavy losses. So from that point of view, Army Group South did manage to survive, but not without very considerable losses, and not without a number of severe crises which really shook the command from top to bottom.
In 1941 had been a successful year for the German army in Russia by any standards. Although they had not captured Moscow or Leningrad, they stood at the gates of both of these cities and could choose to strike at either. The natural expectation was that the focus for the 1942 campaign would again be a German attempt on Moscow. But Hitler managed to deceive the world. The strategic focus for the campaign of 1942 would actually fall upon Army Group South. Even Hitler recognized that all three German army groups in Russia could not attack at the same time, and he deftly switched the whole emphasis onto the campaign in the south. In doing so, he caught Stalin completely off balance. For the summer campaign of 1942, codenamed Operation Blue, Army Group South, now under the command of Fedor von Bock, was strongly reinforced so that almost half of the entire German armed forces in Russia were allocated to the sector controlled by Army Group South. For more effective command and control of such a huge army, the command was split into two separate subgroups, Army Group A and Army Group B. While Army Group B drove off from Kharkov in the direction of Stalingrad, Army Group A was to attack from positions around Rostov in order to extend the German conquest into the Caucasus Mountains and to capture the precious oil fields which Germany desperately required in order to sustain her war effort.
I think it's important to recognise that by 1942 there was a different war on. By now the Second World War had developed into a confrontation between Germany and Great Britain, the largest empire in the world, the United States, the largest economy in the world, and the Soviet Union, which possessed the largest army in the world. It appeared to be absolutely imperative, therefore, that the Germans strike the Russians such a blow in 1942 as to either knock them out of the war completely or render them simply no more than a nuisance before turning to deal with arguably the more powerful combination of the United States and Great Britain. Therefore, German commanders tended to look towards the southern area of the Soviet Union with its oil reserves, its economic resources and its agricultural riches.
Once Army Group South had recovered from the heavy fighting of the winter and the famous Russian mud set in, then Army Group South was geared up for really decisive operations on the Soviet-German front. The idea was to break through the Soviet southwestern front and then swing into the Caucasus, which would accomplish quite a number of strategic objectives, but mainly, of course, Hitler's insistence that it was essential to reach the oil of the Caucasus. That was the first thing. So Operation Blau, which was embodied in this, was extremely important.
The German summer campaign of 1942 was to prove one of the most spectacularly successful of the entire war. It began with the capture of Sevastopol. After bitter fighting, the defenses of the city, which had endured a siege lasting 258 days, were finally battered into submission by the heaviest guns in the German armory. The Wehrmacht could now continue to advance without fear for the rear area, but the men of Army Group South were marching into hell. That hell was created by the Luftwaffe, who pounded the city of Stalingrad to rubble from the air. They hoped to terrify the garrison into surrender. In fact, they created a ready-made defensive position which was to produce some of the most terrible scenes of World War II. Army Group B had reached the city of Stalingrad at the beginning of September. Almost immediately, a fierce battle which would last for 2 months commenced for control of the city. Although the fighting was intense and unusually heavy, there were few portents of the disaster which was shortly to follow. While Army Group B was dealing with the events around Stalingrad, Army Group A pushed deeper into the Caucasus, and by November had reached Maikop, the very farthest point of the German advance. Wehrmacht forces had traveled the length of European Russia and now approached the borders with Iran and Turkey, 2,000 miles from home. They were now nearer to Cairo than Berlin, and there was a serious discussion of the possibility of Army Group South linking up with Rommel's Africa Corps.
The German army in the south was able to drive right through to the gates of the Caucasus. It took Rostov, and in the period of July and August, this precipitated a major crisis in the Soviet High Command. It led Stalin, by the way, in July and August to argue that this was the greatest crisis that they had faced. He issued a draconian order, a really draconian order, that those who showed signs of cowardice or unauthorized retreat should be shot. Others who wavered in the line of duty should be sent to penal battalions. And this was a measure, certainly a public and open measure, of how grave the crisis had become for the Red Army. But there was one other important feature which was rather baffling to the German High Command and even to Hitler himself. What they thought would ensue would be major encirclement battles, more or less on the pattern of the summer of 1941, and they didn't take place. There was no huge encirclement of the Red Armies. Armies which had, in a sense, begun to withdraw in perhaps better order than in 1941. And so, therefore, the huge encirclement battles didn't take place.
The capture of the oil fields of Maikop was enormously significant for Germany. Of less strategic significance was this famous propaganda exercise. A specially trained mountaineer was dispatched to climb Mount Elborus, the highest mountain in the Caucasus. Overcoming Russian resistance and natural hazards, the party planted the German flag on top of the mountain. It was a symbolic gesture, but perhaps it symbolized the wrong thing for Hitler. It actually symbolized that the limit of the German advance had been reached. Ominous clouds were gathering further to the north at Stalingrad. The storm was now about to break.
Army Group B was directed to strike forward to Stalingrad, and the Sixth Army under Paulus was very successful. It penetrated the Soviet fronts, it broke over the Don, it arrived at the approaches to Stalingrad, and in a very daring move by a panzer unit, actually managed to slice the city in two by driving to the north and reaching the Volga. Whereupon huge alarm bells rang in Moscow. But taking part of the city didn't mean that they'd occupied the city.
For 2 months, the Sixth Army had been grinding its way towards capturing the city, which was named after Stalin himself. They had almost succeeded. The relentless and bloody fighting had led to the capture of 4/5 of the now ruined city.
I think the paradox about the Battle of Stalingrad is this, that neither side expected to fight it. The Germans didn't, and the Russians didn't. Stalingrad, in a sense, blew up in their faces, and for a number of reasons, partly military, but I think also political and psychological on the part of Hitler and Stalin. The Battle of Stalingrad became what it was. It became a test of will, it became a test of commitment, it became a test of capability, it became a political signal. And in the attempt to reduce Stalingrad, the city itself, then of course Sixth Army got drawn closer and closer into the city itself.
Although it was holding on by its fingertips, the Red Army did know that the German army was being pushed to the very limits of its capacity. Both sides of the thinly stretched line to the north and south of Stalingrad were held by low-quality Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. It was upon these divisions that the Russian attack would break. Many of the German High Command were aware of the dangers, and Zeitzler, the Chief of Staff, actually flew to Hitler's headquarters in order to plead for permission for a withdrawal before the coming Soviet offensive had even begun. But Hitler was emphatic. He refused to move his troops from the Volga, and the rest is history. In late November 1942, the ferocious Russian counterattack began.
Embedded in the city, as Sixth Army was, it was an ideal target for encirclement, as the Russians first of all struck from the south, around the Berkatover Berl, south of Stalingrad, and struck from the north. This was a major change in Soviet plans. The original Soviet plan had been directing attacks on the Sixth Army from the north, which were really futile attacks, which didn't accomplish anything at all. So that in the Soviet High Command, under Zhukov and Vasilevsky, it was decided that something else must be done. So it wasn't only a question of encircling Sixth Army within the city itself, it had to be a wider encirclement, and thus it became a double encirclement. You encircled the army in the city itself, but you made sure that it was fully encircled by attacking on the wider flanks.
The encircled Sixth Army under von Paulus was ordered to hold firm and await relief by a new force, known as Army Group Dawn, under the command of von Manstein. Army Group Dawn doggedly fought its way to within 30 miles of Stalingrad, but von Paulus refused to break out without a direct order to do so from the Führer.
In the early stages of the encirclement, in late November 1942 and the first days of December 1942, the German Sixth Army, if given permission, could have broken out of the encirclement. The main reason for this is that while the Russians encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, they perceived that they would be encircling in the region of 80 to 100,000 men. In actual fact, it is clear from the historical sources that they encircled in the region of 250,000 men. If, therefore, in late November and December 1942, von Paulus, the commander of the German Sixth Army, had been given permission to break out to the southwest, it seems reasonable to assume that the German Sixth Army would still have retained the combat power to achieve this.
As supplies dwindled and the airlift promised by a boastful Goering failed, the Sixth Army weakened and died, and the remnants surrendered in February 1943. "90,000 men marched into captivity. Only 5,000 would survive to see Germany again." The disappearance of a complete army from their German order of battle was a catastrophic blow to the German forces fighting in the south. But there was worse news to come. In the wake of the capture of Stalingrad, the Russian forces took advantage of the huge gap which appeared in the German lines and surged on to recapture Kharkov. The situation looked bleak indeed for Army Group South, and there was a real danger that Army Group A would be trapped in the Caucasus. Von Kleist had to practically beg Hitler for permission to withdraw, and only succeeded in getting his armies away by the skin of their teeth. Had the Sixth Army not held out for so long in Stalingrad, it is unlikely that Army Group A would have been able to escape from the Caucasus, which they did by the narrowest of margins in January 1943.
Hitler, having been made aware of the threat to Army Group A in the Caucasus region of the Soviet Union on the 27th of January 1943, fully 10 days before the Stalingrad pocket was finally liquidated, authorised the withdrawal of those forces of Army Group A which were within the Caucasus regions into the main area of European Russia. It is quite clear that this decision to permit the strategic withdrawal of Army Group A saved it from being trapped in the Caucasus region and eventually destroyed in a manner similar to the German Sixth Army, part of Army Group B.
If the Sixth Army had withdrawn from Stalingrad, it might have pulled part of the roof down on the whole German front and therefore facilitated the movement of more Soviet forces. They would have been free to attack. They might then have been able to seal off entirely the Caucasus and trap not only the Sixth Army, but the 17th Army and the panzer groups as well. So the argument is that by tying down substantial Soviet forces, it was a sacrifice which was worthwhile. And while Sixth Army was forced to surrender, what nevertheless happened was the withdrawal and retrieval of 17th Army and 1st Panzer from the Caucasus was virtually guaranteed.
Army Group A escaped from the Caucasus just in the nick of time. By February, the Russians were on the eastern outskirts of Rostov, and in the north had surged on to recapture Kharkov in February 1943. At this desperate juncture, the German forces Field Marshal von Manstein emerged as the savior of Army Group South. Not only did he manage to stabilize the crumbling situation and so thwart any further Russian advance, he also managed to get the German forces moving onto a counterattack. Against Hitler's orders, the 1st SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Paul Hauser, had to abandon Kharkov in order to save themselves from imminent destruction. Under the guidance of von Manstein, they now attacked the city once more and recaptured it in the bloody fighting which became known as the Third Battle for Kharkov. Kharkov was just one of a string of successes for Manstein. By the summer of 1943, he had produced the amazing reversal of fortunes that is often referred to as Manstein's miracle.
When all seemed lost and it looked as if the entire Soviet-German wing was crumbling, it was Manstein who took command of this. He launched a counterstroke which really pushed the Russians entirely off balance, and even more important, it did provide a configuration of the front just before the spring mud set in.
It is fair to say that the counteroffensive that Manstein launched in late February and March 1943 remains one of the most impressive military achievements of the 20th century by one of the most impressive military commanders that the world has witnessed. On the other hand, one should not exaggerate its importance. It did provide the Russians with a bloody nose, which taught them a very severe lesson not to underestimate the resilience of the German army. On the other hand, while Manstein took back a considerable amount of territory, including the 4th largest city of the Soviet Union, Kharkov, from the Russian forces, all that he actually managed to achieve in strategic terms was to return the German army to the line from which it had begun its major operations in the southern area of the Soviet Union in June 1942.
These victories turned a disastrous defeat into a stable platform from which Hitler was able to launch the last great German offensive of World War II, Operation Citadel. It was high noon for the German forces in Russia.
Both sides were aware it was make or break. Whichever side accomplished a decisive blow, it would be, in real terms, decisive. And I think that's the significance of the Battle of Kursk.
Army Group South provided the southern wing of the massive German offensive at Kursk. The spearhead was the 4th Panzer Army led by General Hoth. It was these men who fought the greatest tank battle in history, which saw thousands of machines clash outside the village of Prokhorovka.
If the Germans really wanted finally to plant the dagger, right in the heart of the Soviet Union, they had to get through there. The idea was to break through to Kursk and then swing and then drive on Moscow. So it was, if you like, a strategic battle with the idea of a coup de grace behind it. I mean, this was, as I've said, to be decisive, and it had to be really decisive.
The battle for the Kursk salient was a colossal affair, but the defenders had the edge. The well-prepared Soviet defenses ground down the attacking German forces, which included the famous Leibstandarte division, supported with the new Tiger tanks. The new generation of German armor in the face of the Panther was first seen at Kursk, as was the ill-fated Elephant heavy tank destroyer, seen here. Despite the lavish promise of new equipment, tactically, Operation Citadel could be called a draw. The Germans made some progress, both in the north and the south of the Kursk salient, but strategically the battle was a disaster.
In purely military terms, I don't think there's any doubt that Kursk was the decisive turning point on the Eastern Front. However, in psychological terms, most people would argue that the Battle of Stalingrad and its impact upon the German army was actually more significant, and that in some respects, therefore, Kursk only tended to confirm the emergence of Russian military competence on the Eastern Front, which would deny the Germans the victory that they were seeking. After the Battle of Kursk, however, it is clear that the German army no longer retained the capability to launch large-scale operational offensives against the Red Army. After Kursk, the Red Army had seized the initiative completely at the strategic, operational, and indeed the tactical level.
Germany had now lost the initiative on the Russian front. There would never again be the opportunity for a full-scale offensive. With their confidence sky high after Kursk, the Red Army surged on and drove the men of Army Group South back from the River Donets to a new defensive line on the River Dnieper. Although the situation was grave, it was not yet terminal. But at this juncture, Adolf Hitler intervened, and his fateful intervention sealed the fate of Army Group South. Despite the obvious danger, Hitler refused to allow the 17th Army to retreat from the Crimean Peninsula and insisted that the Crimea be held at all costs.
Hitler regarded the Romanian oil fields of Ploiești as being absolutely essential to the German military effort, and thought that if the Russian Air Force was able to gain a foothold in the Crimea, it would bring these oil fields under sustained fire, thus denying the German army the ability to utilise them. This, he believed, would completely compromise the German army's mobility, denying it the opportunity to defeat the Red Army he saw as the major threat to the survival of the German state and nation.
He still had full confidence in the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine to rescue the army in case they could not be relieved, but he was wrong. The 17th Army remained trapped in the Crimea and finally surrendered in May 1944, when some 80,000 survivors marched into captivity.
Now, if Hitler had been flexible, which he wasn't, which was essentially one of the serious problems on the Soviet-German front, then the 17th Army could have been saved and retrieved. What happened, it was simply bottled up, and it was waiting there for eventual destruction. And that happened on so many instances on the Soviet-German front. Hitler, having got hold of the idea from the crisis of 1941-42 that there was much profit to be gained from holding fast, from standing fast. I mean, his concern about the implications of withdrawal not only trapped the 17th Army, it trapped many other armies. And at a time, actually, looking at the whole strategic scene, where mobility, mobile defense was the order of the day, and many German generals recommended this, then, of course, to do the very opposite, to lock people up, to deprive them of a chance to survive, or even a chance to use their capabilities, well, it simply amounted to the equivalent of a death sentence.
From now on, only bitter fighting retreats awaited Army Group South. They still put up some incredible resistance. The dogged fighting retreat, which allowed 30,000 trapped soldiers to escape from a pocket near Kherson, is a lasting testament to courage in adversity.
Although 30,000 German troops managed to escape from the pocket, the condition of these troops shocked senior German commanders. It is quite clear that the Stalingrad complex, the deep fear of being encircled by Russian forces, was beginning to have a severe impact upon the tactical and operational capabilities of the German army against a Red Army that was now proving itself altogether more capable of inflicting these kind of defeats through large-scale manoeuvre operations upon the German army than it had been of doing in the years 1941-42. Therefore, the winter battles of 1943-44 can be regarded as an important transitional period in which the German army lost its ability to conduct large-scale operational manoeuvre operations, and the Red Army gained a new ability to do so with the skill and panache bettered only by the German army in its golden years of 1939 to 42.
General Hube's famous fighting withdrawal in March 1944 was another stirring feat of endurance and tenacity. But the writing was on the wall for the Wehrmacht in Russia.
So it was this switch, this rapid switch from the strategic defensive to the strategic offensive, which had a decisive part to play in the nature of the Soviet operations. And the idea was really to move as fast and as far as they could, to recover as much territory as they could. And Stalin constantly urged these armies onward and forward. And from, I would say, the early or late winter of 1943, the danger to the German southern wing increases and increases. The climax comes in late winter or early spring of 1944, by which time the Russians have driven deeply into Ukraine. They've taken Kiev, by the way, and it appears that they are even moving further and faster to the west.
The destruction of Army Group Center in June 1944 created a huge gap in the German front in Russia. In order to manage the overstretched forces of Army Group South, it was again divided into two separate commands. Army Group North Ukraine under Model and Army Group South Ukraine under Schorner.
I would say, and many would agree, that the damage to the German southern wing by that time was almost irreparable.
The Russian advance was now a headlong dash. Despite some tenacious resistance during the fierce summer battles of 1944, there was little that could now be done to prevent the final defeat. On the 20th of September 1944, the Army Group South title was again revived and bestowed on a scratch group of formations fighting under General Freisner. But the inevitable could not be delayed much longer. For a time, the rather pathetic rumor that Army Group South was about to join forces to fight with the Americans against the Russians gained currency, but by now, they were clutching at straws. Operation Spring Awakening, designed to roll back the Red Army, proved to be the final offensive by the Wehrmacht in the east. And the last remaining forces of Army Group South, under their last commander, General Rendulic, surrendered near Vienna in May 1945. The long struggle was finally over. They were supported by a powerful armored formation known as Panzer Group 1, under the leadership of von Kleist. Air cover was provided by Luftflotte 1, under General Keller.
Field Marshal Geert von Rundstedt was a well-known and well-respected German military leader. He had played a key role in the invasion of France in 1940 and had been amongst German units who had come closest to Paris in 1914 during the beginning of the First World War. He was well respected by the commanders underneath him and by the troops. He was known as a somewhat reserved and haughty individual, but nevertheless represented a very obvious symbol of traditional German military excellence.
Unlike the other two army groups, Army Group South was not entirely composed of German divisions. It did here. When Hitler decided on his surprise attack on Russia, the Army High Command produced a plan which envisaged a strike by 3 separate army groups. This huge mass of men included over 3.5. The dramatic events which were played out on the Russian front during the titanic struggle between Hitler and Stalin reached a peak of intensity and decisiveness on the southern front, the area of Army Group South. It was this sector which witnessed the terrible siege of Sevastopol, the disaster at Stalingrad, the fury of Operation Citadel, and the horrors of the Korsun Pocket. It is no exaggeration to say that the outcome of World War II was decided. 500,000 German soldiers, supported by 3,500 tanks. Army Group North was to strike through the Baltic states and drive on towards Leningrad. Army Group Center was poised to strike at Moscow, and Army Group South was ordered to drive into the southern part of the USSR. The initial targets were Odessa and the Crimea, but the final strategic objective was the capture of the oil fields in the Caucasus. Army Group South was commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He had at his disposal 3 separate subsidiary armies: the 6th Army, initially commanded by von Reichenau, the 11th Army, commanded by von Schobert, and the 17th Army, under Stulpnagel. A considerable portion of the 11th Army was made up of Romanian forces. Although these men could and would fight with great courage, their training and equipment was certainly inferior to the Wehrmacht. The principal reason for the inclusion of Romanian formations in Army Group South was the fact that von Rundstedt's army group was to act in close cooperation with the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies. The Romanians were to join with the Germans as allies for the unheralded assault on Russia. That great surprise attack was codenamed Operation Barbarossa. It was launched on June the 22nd, 1941.
In the first phase of the German invasion of Russia and operations in the south,